Who was G.E. Moore?
Well, I am.
No, but who was he?
He's me.
Okay, shut up, G.E. Moore. George Edward Moore, born in 1873 in London, was a British philosopher who made lasting contributions in the field of ethics and is hailed as one of the founders of analytic philosophy. When the two men were in their early 20s, his friend Bertrand Russell wrote, "I almost worship him as if he were a god. I have never felt such an extravagant admiration for anybody." Moore went on from being a student at Cambridge to being a professor in Cambridge starting in 1925. He wrote perhaps his most famous work, Principia Ethica, in 1903. In it, he argues for ethical non-naturalism. He says that ethics is not reducible to any feature of the natural world. This gave rise to the study of metaethics in the 20th century. The question is, what is good? What things are good in themselves and what things are good as a means to an end? Moore was writing in reaction and response to a school of ethical thought that was popularized in the mid-19th century. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill had written detailed explanations of how a utilitarian ethic would work, the belief that maximizing happiness is the ethical thing to do. Mill had published his book on utilitarianism in 1861. Moore was also responding to Darwin, who in 1859 had published Origin of the Species. Evolutionary biology was developing and would suggest that morality developed by supervening good on top of, for instance, pleasure. But Moore says that if this were true, the proposition pleasure is good is just a tautology. It doesn't say anything. It only states that pleasure is pleasure. In fact, though, the question, is pleasure good, is not a tautology. It's not what Moore calls a closed question. It's an open question. Closed questions are meaningless, like asking, is pleasure pleasure? But the question, is pleasure good, is a meaningful question, so Moore calls that an open question. So ethical naturalism fails. To argue that something is good because it is equivalent to a natural thing, like pleasure, is to commit the naturalistic fallacy. Goodness is separate from other natural things. It is a thing in and of itself. Moore agrees with hedonism that pleasure is good in and of itself, but it is not the only good thing. Beauty, for instance, is also good. Good itself, in fact, is not definable. It can only be discerned by intuition. It exists like the color yellow. You cannot explain yellow to a blind person, nor could you explain goodness to someone who does not experience it. It is something that can only be picked up by intuition, and we simply immediately recognize it. However, remember, good is non-natural, by which Moore means it is incapable of being scrutinized by the natural sciences. It's not any other natural thing. Good is good in and of itself. It is not equivalent to a natural thing. It is natural in the sense that it occurs in the world as a fact, like the color yellow, but it's not identical with any other natural thing, like pleasure or beauty. Good in itself is discernible by intuition, but Moore insists that he is not an intuitionist. You can't solve moral debates simply by appealing to intuition. Rather, things that are good, as a means, require the evaluation of consequences to determine whether or not they would produce good, like duties. Duty, Moore defines as what generally produces the most good in the foreseeable future against probable alternatives. Duties are mostly common sense, but the goodness of a duty is evaluated rationally by its consequences, whereas good is good in and of itself. The consequences are irrelevant. Intuition could tell you what goodness is, but only a common sense evaluation of consequences could tell you whether or not a duty, a good as a means to an end, was in fact good. So Moore says he is not committed to moral intuitionism when it comes to solving moral dilemmas like, is abortion wrong? Intuition can only reveal what is good in and of itself, like pleasure or beauty. Moore's emphasis on common sense, empiricism, and intuition would lead him to reject skepticism. At the time, British philosophy was largely committed to a kind of idealism, the belief that ideas within one's own mind were the only real things, and beliefs about the external world, the world outside of our minds, didn't enjoy as much certainty. Moore simply says that the intuitions about skepticism being true are less plausible on common sense than intuitions about the external world existing. There's no reason to trust the intuitions about skepticism, like when we say, maybe I'm just dreaming, or maybe an evil demon is planting false beliefs in my mind. There's no reason to trust those intuitions more than the intuition that our senses are just getting it right. In his 1939 essay, Proof of an External World, he wrote, I can prove now, for instance, that two human hands exist. How? By holding up my two hands and saying, as I make a certain gesture with the right hand, here is one hand, and adding, as I make a certain gesture with the left, and here is another. This is Moore's epistemic common sense realism. Now, there are a couple of problems that develop from Moore's ethic. First of all, if goodness can simply be known by intuition, why are there so many moral disagreements? Why is ethical theory so rich and debated? And why are the debates so hot? If we all by intuition alone can simply discern good, we should probably, one would think, share the same page more often than we do. The second problem is that some of Moore's philosophy might be question begging. He says that the question, is pleasure good, is an open question, meaning that that question is meaningful. But asserting that it's open is actually question begging, because he's trying to prove that good is meaningfully different than pleasure. He shouldn't assume that it is in the premises if that's what he intends to conclude. Moore's contributions to ethics have been significant and lasting, particularly his identifying of the naturalistic fallacy. Moore died in 1958, but his works are still analyzed, discussed, and debated by ethicists today.